In the final weeks of the war in Europe, as the Third Army drove through Bavaria and into the collapsing heart of the Reich, Patton's forces were encountering something that no amount of military experience could fully prepare a man for. Not the resistance. The resistance was fading. What they were encountering was the evidence. The accumulated, undeniable physical evidence of what the regime they had spent years fighting had actually been doing while the world was occupied with the war. They were finding the camps. They were finding the mass graves. They were finding towns where the civilians looked at the approaching Americans with an expression that was somewhere between relief and the desperate hope that the Americans wouldn't ask too many questions about what had been happening in the fields outside town for the last several years. And they were finding something else. Something that in some ways disturbed Patton's officers more than the camps, because the camps at least had the quality of a system, something organized and deliberate, and therefore something that could be attributed to a specific apparatus and a specific command structure. What they were also finding were the executions, not the industrial executions of the death facilities, the immediate ones, the ones that were still happening in the final days and hours of a regime that was killing its own people as fast as the Americans were killing its soldiers. Boys, some of them 15 and 16 years old, conscripted into Volkssturm units in the last desperate mobilization, hanged from lamp posts and bridge railings with signs around their necks: deserter, coward, traitor to the fatherland. The signs were still there when the American units arrived. The boys were still hanging. Patton saw the photographs before he saw the sights themselves. His intelligence officers brought them to him at his forward headquarters, and the officers who were present when he looked through them said he went very quiet in a way that was different from his usual silences. Patton was not a quiet man. His silences were usually brief, followed by action or profanity or both. This silence lasted longer than that. He asked who was responsible. The answer was not simple, because the authority to carry out these executions had been distributed through the SS and through the military courts that the regime had used in its final months to terrorize its own population into continued resistance. But in the sector where the Third Army was operating, the name that kept appearing in the intelligence reports was a mid-level SS commander, a man named Hauptsturmführer Verner Kesseler. Kesseler was not a figure of particular historical prominence. He was not one of the architects of the regime's crimes. He was something in some ways more representative. He was a functionary, a man who had been given authority and had used it with complete literalness, carrying out the orders he received without visible hesitation or reflection, right up until the moment when it became clear that carrying them out was going to have personal consequences. The intelligence on Kesseler was specific. He had been directly responsible for at least a dozen young soldiers in the weeks preceding the Third Army's arrival in his sector. Some of them had been trying to desert. Some of them had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong moment when Kesseler needed to demonstrate that the SS was still enforcing discipline. Several of them had been executed on his personal order, without any formal proceeding. He had signed the orders himself. There were documents. There were also witnesses, civilians who had seen it happen, German soldiers who'd been present, and who were now surrendering to the Americans in sufficient numbers that the intelligence officers had begun to assemble a picture of what had occurred. When Kesseler's location was identified, Patton ordered him taken, not processed through the standard prisoner channels, brought directly to Third Army headquarters. The order was unusual enough that Patton's chief of staff asked for clarification. Patton gave it in 4 words: "Bring him to me." Kesseler was captured on a Tuesday morning, attempting to blend into a column of retreating Wehrmacht soldiers by removing his SS insignia and presenting forged papers identifying him as a regular army corporal. The deception lasted approximately 15 minutes, which was how long it took an American intelligence sergeant who'd spent the previous 3 weeks processing German prisoners to notice that the man's hands did not match his uniform, and that his bearing was not the bearing of a corporal. He was transported to Third Army headquarters under guard. The officers who witnessed the encounter between Patton and Kesseler described it in their subsequent accounts with a consistency that suggests they were all watching something they understood they would not forget. Patton did not conduct the meeting in his office. He had Kesseler brought to him in a forward area, near one of the sites where his forces had found the evidence of what Kesseler's command had been doing. This was a choice, not a circumstance. Patton wanted the conversation to happen in a specific place for a specific reason. Kesseler arrived in the custody of an MP escort. He had been given back his SS uniform, or rather had been required to wear it, because Patton had specified that he wanted the man brought in the uniform he had actually been wearing when he gave his orders, not the disguise he had been captured in. Patton looked at him for a long time before saying anything. Then he asked Kesseler how old the youngest boy had been. Kesseler said he didn't understand the question. Patton said he understood the question perfectly and to answer it. There was a pause. Kesseler said that he had been carrying out lawful orders under the military code of the Reich, that the executions had been conducted in accordance with the authority vested in his command, and that he expected to be treated as a prisoner of war under the terms of the Geneva Convention. Patton listened to this. He let the man finish. Then he said that he had been moving through Germany for weeks, and that he had seen what the authority vested in commands like Kesseler's had produced, and that he was going to say something clearly so that there would be no misunderstanding. He said that the boys who had been hanged from the bridges in Kesseler's sector were soldiers of the German army who had committed no crime, except the crime of understanding what Kesseler apparently had not yet understood, which was that the war was over, and that dying for a regime in its final hours served no purpose that any rational person could defend. He said that he had spent his entire career distinguishing between soldiers and what they were fighting for, and that the distinction mattered to him, and that the soldiers who had been executed in Kesseler's sector had deserved better from the men who commanded them than a rope and a sign. And then Patton said something that the officers present remembered with particular clarity. He said that he had no interest in Kesseler's explanation of his legal authority, because the legal authority of the Reich had ended the moment the Reich ceased to function as a state, which in practical terms had occurred several weeks before this conversation. He said that what he was looking at was a man who had used the time remaining to him not to protect the soldiers under his command, not to preserve their lives against an outcome that was already inevitable, but to kill them for the crime of recognizing the inevitable before he did. He said that he had met a great many German officers in the preceding weeks, and that the ones he had respected, even the ones who had fought against him with genuine skill and courage, had understood that their obligation to their men did not end when the military situation became hopeless. He said that the obligation to their men was in fact the only obligation that mattered when everything else was gone. Kesseler attempted again to invoke the Geneva Convention. He said that he was a prisoner of war, and that his conduct in the execution of his duties was a matter for proper legal proceedings, not for a conversation in a field in Bavaria with an American general. Patton said he agreed completely. He said that there would absolutely be proper legal proceedings, and that the documentation his forces had collected, and the witnesses they had already identified, and the signed orders that bore Kesseler's name would all be part of those proceedings, and that he was confident the proceedings would be thorough and accurate.
Then he said that he wanted to make sure Kesseler understood one thing before those proceedings occurred, because he was not certain that Kesseler had yet grasped the full nature of his situation. He said that the war crimes investigation that was going to examine Kesseler's record was not going to be conducted by the Reich, and it was not going to be evaluated by the standards of the Reich, and the authority that Kesseler had been invoking as his justification was not going to be recognized as authority by the people conducting the investigation. He said that Kesseler had made a series of decisions under the assumption that the framework he was operating in would continue to exist, and that framework was gone, and the decisions remained, and the people who had died as a result of those decisions remained. And the only thing that was going to matter now was an honest accounting of who had made which decision and why. He said that he had one question, and he would like an honest answer to it, and the question was simple. In the moment when Kesseler signed the order that sent the youngest of those soldiers to his death, had he believed it would make any difference to the outcome of the war? Kesseler did not answer. Patton nodded as though the silence was itself an answer, which perhaps it was. He said that he had spent more time than he wanted to think about trying to understand a certain category of men, the ones who enforced the cruelest demands of a system not because they believed in the system's ultimate victory, but because the enforcement was the only authority they had, and losing the war did not require them to give it up. He said that he found this category of men the most difficult to understand of all the things he had encountered in the war, harder than the fanaticism, harder than the ideological commitment, because at least those things had a coherent internal logic.
He said that what Kesseler had done had no such logic. The boys were going to be free within days regardless. The war's outcome was not altered by their deaths. The only thing accomplished was that they were dead. Kesseler was transferred to the War Crimes Processing System that afternoon. The documentation against him was substantial. The subsequent proceedings were part of the broader effort to prosecute SS conduct in the final phase of the war, an effort that produced varied and often unsatisfying outcomes, as all such efforts did when applied to a system that had distributed its crimes across thousands of individual decisions by thousands of individual men. What is documented is that Patton filed a personal statement regarding the case. This was unusual. He did not typically insert himself into the administrative processing of captured enemy personnel. His statement was a single page. It described what his forces had found in Kesseler's sector. It described the evidence that had been collected, and it concluded with a single observation in the direct and unambiguous language that characterized everything Patton wrote when he was writing for the record rather than for an audience. He wrote that he had spoken with the officer responsible, and that the officer had offered the standard defense of orders and authority and legal framework. He wrote, but he had found this defense unpersuasive on the simple grounds that no authority could make the killing of your own soldiers in the final days of a lost war into a military necessity, and that a commander who could not find the distinction between discipline and murder at the moment when his command was disintegrating had not, in Patton's judgment, understood the first thing about what command actually meant. He wrote that command meant responsibility for the lives of the men under you, not authority over those lives, responsibility for them. He wrote that there was a version of military service that understood this and a version that did not, and that the evidence his army had been collecting as it moved across Germany demonstrated with absolute clarity which version had been in charge. The entry in his diary for that evening was brief. He had met the man responsible for the boys on the bridges. He had said what he had to say. The rest was for others to determine through proper process. He returned to his work. There was still a war to finish and an occupation to begin, and 100 things that required the attention of the commander of the most effective army in the field. He had never in his life believed in spending time on what was already decided. He believed in moving forward. But the men who served under him, the ones who were present for the conversation with Kesseler, said that they had understood something that day about what Patton actually thought command was for. Not for victory, though he pursued that with everything he had. Not for personal legacy, though he was not indifferent to it, but for the men. Always, underneath everything else, for the men. And when he stood in a field in Bavaria and told an SS commander what he thought of orders that served nothing except the system that issued them, he was saying something he had believed his entire career, that the first obligation of a soldier to the people he commanded was to bring as many of them home as the war allowed, and that any officer who had forgotten that obligation had forgotten the only thing about the job that actually mattered.